Welcome back, students. We're so glad that you're back in small group. And this week we're picking up in our fourth week of our Guide Mark series. And we're looking at the D in the word guide, which is depending on God in everything. And I'm excited because we have Randy Dane here. He's our equipping pastor here at Brazos Point, here to talk to us a little bit about depending on God in everything. And it's actually what he talked about this Sunday at church.
Yeah, and what we talked about was that feeling of being in over your head. And I know as students, I don't have to tell you much about that. You know what that's like between juggling relationships and extracurricular and schoolwork and all the things that are on your plate. You know what it's like to feel stressed and pressed and pulled in lots of different directions and to have this sense of needing to depend on something. And that goes right to what we looked at Sunday. We looked at Acts 16, which I think is a fascinating story in the Bible. We see the Apostle Paul and his apprentice Silas doing the work of missionaries, and doing that work lands them in prison. How do you respond when you go to prison for sharing the gospel? Well, Acts 16:25 tells us that at about midnight, Paul and Silas are praying and they're singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners are listening into them. They're praying and singing, right? They just got thrown in prison for worshiping this God and telling other people about him. And what's their reaction? Let's just worship and pray more. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's such a crazy picture, and I think it's a great reminder of what it looks like to depend on God. And I actually wanted to read the description that we wrote about depending on God and everything, and this is what it says. It says, personal growth requires worship, a total surrender to God. When I surrender my own ideas, plans, and comforts to God, I will boldly trust Him in every aspect of my life. And so, Randy, many times we find ourselves in situations where we're stretched, we're being overwhelmed. We find ourselves in a situation where we just don't know where to turn. Give us some practical tips. How do we actually depend on God in these moments?
I think the example that we see from the Apostle Paul in Acts 16 actually is a very, very practical tip of what we do. They're praying and they're worshiping. And I know that sounds way too simple, right? It's like, oh, those are basic things. That's what Christ followers do. But think about that. When we're going through whatever it is that we're going through, where we're in over our head, like those are the ways to respond and react. And it really is that simple. And the way that helps me to think about why this is the right thing to do is to think about the opposite. And I'll be honest, sometimes my reaction when I'm in over my head is just paddle faster and paddle harder and work at trying to save and rescue myself in those circumstances. That really brings me to this point that I asked the question, who am I really depending on here? Am I depending on God or am I depending on myself? If I'm depending on myself, I'm looking at my own abilities. If I'm depending on God, I'm praying that His limitless abilities will come through for me. If I'm depending on myself, I'm ultimately worshiping myself. If I'm worshiping God, I recognize that this God who is our good and loving Father loves to provide for His kids and to see us through these situations and these circumstances. You know, I think for you as students, one of the things that you have to begin to understand is that in a culture that tells us independence is everything, that actually dependence is the way that God created us and wired us, because He wants us to live dependent on Him. And that's what we see with the Apostle Paul. He's depending on God to get him out of this mess. And then what happens? God rescues and God frees. And by a miracle, He opens up the prison and He opens that up, and we see Paul be released. And what happens is, when we depend on God, He provides for us. That's a big deal for us to learn and to understand, because not only will it change our own lives, it will also have the potential to impact the lives of folks around us.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point. And students, I want you to hear from a student who was dealing with something beyond his own control, and how his response in that moment and how his decision to depend on God in the midst of the storm not only influenced his own faith, but also someone incredibly close to him.
I stepped over the line of faith last year at summer camp, and then pretty much right when we got back, a couple weeks after that, I got baptized. Then about a week after I got baptized, that's when the doctors diagnosed me with a heart condition. Well, I just went in for my normal, just yearly checkup, and my blood pressure was high, so I went to the hospital, and they just said I had something wrong with me, and then they were suggesting surgeries and stuff. Everybody's baby, there's a cord that forms. And that cord, when it formed, it wrapped around part of my heart. My parents they didn't know what to say. My small group felt the same as my family. They were all surprised because it looks like there's nothing wrong with me, but really there's a lot wrong. Yeah, I just really relied on God a lot. I just thought, He's got me. He's going to take me through this. I was really nervous when I actually got to the hospital to get the surgery, and I was sitting there waiting in the room. I just started praying. I was praying to ask Him just to let me through this, like going to bed and waking up, just asking Him, just let me wake up. A close friend that really helped me through that time was Austin Hoskins. I've known him for most of my life. Yeah, he encouraged me, texting me, you're gonna make it, because Austin was there with me. We both had to depend on God, but just in different ways. The surgery went very well, the doctor said, and I feel way different, better than I've ever felt in my life. I don't have any pain in my legs at all. I can feel my heartbeat everywhere, fingers, feet. Yeah, I feel like God really is real, and He proved it to me through that time. Depending on God really means to me, when you're going through a really rough time, you just found out something bad happened to you or your family, God takes control and helps you through the hard time. I trust God, if I have something rough in school, it could be bullies, missing assignments, anything, or if maybe one of my family members had something happen to them, I just trust them a lot more now.
Students, after having heard Austin's story, I really want you to think about what it looks like for you to depend on God in your life and your story. Maybe there's a storm in your life or a situation and you just don't know where to turn. And I want you to think about what would it look like if you decided to depend on God and His strength instead of your own. Or students, maybe there's not a storm in your life, but maybe God is calling you to depend on Him in some other ways. Maybe God's calling you to depend on Him with your plans or your future or your life. And so students, what does it look like? And I want you, as you head to small group, to think about and to talk about what are some areas in our life we can really depend on God instead of ourselves. And as we begin, students, to talk about these God marks, I want you to see how they fit together and how these are all meant to really help us grow in our faith individually and together. And so, as you're talking about opportunities and ways to depend on God, what does that look like for you to combine that with one of the accountable relationships we talked about last week and bringing someone else into the picture to say, here's an area of my life I really need to start depending on God in, and having them keep you accountable in those moments. And so students, again, when we depend on God in everything, it not only changes our own walk in faith with Jesus, but it also has the power to affect those around us. And again, as we talk about this life of service as well, students, I also want you to know that we're also going to be taking a student-focused mission trip this summer. And if you're still interested, I know many of you have reached out. If you're interested about that in any way, this coming Sunday after every church service, we're going to have a short meeting where you can bring your parents and we can answer any questions you may have and give you all of the information you may need. And so we'll see you there this Sunday. And also high school students, we'll see you up at the church for a high school night next Wednesday. See ya.